Welcome to The Rippling Pages, a podcast on the craft of writing, curated and crafted by me, Liam Bishop. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Claire Carroll. In Claire's collection of stories, we're treated to the wonderful, the wild, and the downright weird of our world. Her stories are anchored by someone who refers to themselves as the unreliable nature writer. From affairs with robots to interminable and frightening bureaucratic loopholes, her stories are written in such a way that they reel you in before you feel immersed and lost in Claire's surreally articulated visions. Claire lives in Somerset, UK, and her writing has appeared in Gutter Magazine, Perverse, Lunate Journal, the Oxonian Review, and Short Fiction Journal. In 2021, her short story, My Brain is Boiling with Ideas, was shortlisted for the prestigious White Review Short Story Prize. We're here to talk about her debut collection of short stories that have just been published by Scratch Books, the unreliable narrator writer. Claire, thank you very much for joining me on the Written Pages.
Thank you.
Let's get into it, and we've got a bit of an introduction there.
Yeah.
But your first story, it features a person joining what appears to be a group of people reading, nominally at least, a writer called Claire's Dreams. They encourage one another before they have to make a strange escape from the building in which they sit. I was reading this and I was thinking about this, and I sort of gone back to read this at the start of the collection, the second reading, and it made me think, books, if we look at them in the right way, they can tell us quite a lot about writing. We can look at mechanics, we'll look at the craft, which is obviously what we enjoy doing on this podcast. But I feel like your stories are just trying to tell us something about the art of reading. I wondered if you could just tell us about what's going on in a story like this, because it's a fantastic introduction to your collection.
I mean, to talk a little bit about that story was constructed in quite a strange way. So the dream that she's reading in that story, I wrote a long time before the rest of the story. So it was this kind of fragmentary piece, and I wanted it in the collection, but it didn't sit. It was just too slight. And I think rather than kind of rework it, I wanted to kind of build around it, I suppose. I think I was thinking a lot at the time about how when you're a writer, you're kind of, and I suppose anybody in any creative field is kind of laboring over something, or there's this production element, this labor element, and then you're having to kind of hold it out and present it, to an audience in exchange for something.
The reason I think it sets us up so interestingly for the rest of the collection is because it is, you spoke about there, the kind of different levels that it has to it, dream, narration. I wondered how did that process come about then? And then thinking about the craft again, where do you start with this? Was it a dream, or was it kind of the mise en scene of them people sort of speaking to the writer Claire about the dream?
So the dream itself was based on an actual dream that I had, and it was just almost like a kind of exercise that I did and then developed into something, which was a very short piece of, it was just like a kind of like a fragment. It wasn't even a piece of flash fiction, because but I think I'm really obsessed with the idea of dreams as these, because it's this idea of your subconscious kind of presenting you with a kind of narrative, even if it is open-ended. So I kind of try and pay attention to those when I can remember them. So I started with that, and then the rest of it was built around there. And I think the idea of dream logic and the kind of, the sort of fluidity of just accepting events as they come to you in dreams, and how that kind of comes up against a kind of a rigorous process, like, some invented housing advisory board, which is what I put into that story. And I think I'm interested in the things that kind of are high stakes for people of our generation, housing being a really key one, and the kind of ludicrousness of a life pursuing something creative. I suppose like systems and bureaucracy impact on us all in increasingly strange ways.
Yeah, there is a lot of, when we're talking about bureaucracy, what do you mean by who are the bureaucrats in this story?
I suppose I'm interested in a kind of disembodied voice of authority. So there's another piece called The Sheer Delight of What You May Become, which is and I like using the second person a lot, like an instructive voice, like you are doing this and you are doing that. I know some readers find that really annoying. But I've always really enjoyed it as a reader because I feel like there's this very kind of, I suppose, this kind of like disingenuous directness that the authoritative person, or the, you know, the kind of faceless authority, knows you and knows what you want to do and wants to have this kind of one-way conversation with you, essentially. And what happens then when you play around with that? Like, what happens when the authoritative voice is, you know, kind of deranged, or I say all this like, and it starts to sound really political, and I'm not trying to do that, but I think it's just that sensation of where power dynamics are, for me, that I'm interested in. It's kind of like the Kafka thing of like the nonsensical sound of somebody who thinks they're in charge, basically, and how that kind of translates to writers, because, you know, we're the ones in charge theoretically, but we're not really. Like, we don't know any more than the reader.
Yeah, we it's not political in the sense of it's ideological. I mean, someone might read it as that, but not the way I'm reading it, in terms of there's not a strict ideology to it. I think it's that question, isn't it, of authority. And if you read in your stories, and it does crop up and manifest in various different ways. But this voice it is recurrent, and it's in another story that just highlighted there, the sheer delight of what you may become, and it's given instructions. But this one in particular, there is more of a. It's trying to manufacture a different emotion. It's trying to sort of manufacture a sense of happiness. Close your eyes. It's a lovely day, isn't it? We're going to imagine together a better world. Does this come in after you've written the story, or is this there in the process of writing a story?
I think it differs from story to story, and I think for me, the place where I start with it, because I'm very like anti-plot, right? So like I'm very, I don't think about, I like, it always starts with like an image, or but normally a voice, or like a feeling, I suppose, and then the voice is kind of like a manifestation of that feeling or that image. So with that story, with the sheer delight of what you may become, I wanted something that was kind of evocative. I was just thinking a lot about this kind of self-hypnosis, self-soothing thing that we're encouraged to do these days, especially with regards to nature. So this idea of, I suppose, the kind of commercialization of meditative practice, the idea that we can kind of imagine ourselves, or kind of dream ourselves, or mindfulness ourselves into a kind of higher state of being, and how that really only goes so far. I kind of wanted that in there as this, almost like this kind of like smotheringly neutralizing voice. I suppose that is the whole thing with the book, is that like I started writing during the pandemic, and I was outside a lot because you know, like doing your nature walks, you know, your state allotted nature walks. And I think I just felt this like powerlessness, and this kind of, you know, you can read and read and read and read, and you're only ever going to know so much on an individual level, and you're only ever going to really have power on an individual level that goes so far. So I think a lot of the book is about like not being an expert and not really knowing very much, but having this sense of discomfort and trying to make sense of that as an individual.
What strikes me, and do correct me if I am wrong, is that there is something in there about forms of knowledge, and whether that relates to a sense of power, or responsibility, autonomy. Either way, it seems like there is all these kind of different forms of knowledge about things that play out in the stories to some extent, but kind of playing out in your mind when you write. But how much, and it makes me think back to the dream, actually. You know, this kind of unremitting stream of knowledge, as you called it, this, where the barriers don't stop the flow of the dream. But also the fact is, the irony is that we don't know, you know, we don't often know what the meanings of our dreams. And in that story, you've kind of got these people trying to interpret the dream for the writer. So it seems like there is quite a lot going on in terms of, and I'm not trying not to discount all the kind of political issues that you spoke about, but it is an interesting position, isn't it, as a writer? And I guess how does it feel, being not just because it is your debut, but because you are sort of bringing these stories, into the world as your first sort of collection. How does it feel as a kind of status of a writer? Bringing holding these issues, I guess, in kind of front of people, but then also kind of constructing them into a story.
Yeah, I mean, again, I suppose there's something kind of nerve-wracking about that, because I take up this position of I mean, I use unreliable because it's like the kind of, it's a buzzword, so it's like intentionally a buzzword, and they're interesting, like they're compelling to read. And I think I wanted to just be, I think I was writing, I realized that like I was writing about this strange state, and there's no, there's no kind of authority that says you can and can't write about this. And in fact, everybody who wants to should. But I do think that is a very kind of, it's a very valid and interesting position for us all to take up, really. And I don't think, that's not to say I think we should be kind of apathetic and see it as part of the everyday, but I think, it is very strange to live through this moment for everybody. And for some people, it's like acutely devastating, depending on where you are in the world. So I guess it's kind of, writing from your perspective of that strangeness and of that kind of grief and powerlessness, but kind of acknowledging that that's not a universal state.
There is. We've spoken about the unreliable nature writer, and it's this dialogue story that sort of intersects the other stories. And they are at what appears to be a wedding, as we find out, which is and as you said, they don't really agree, the two characters, on anything. No, it's not acrimonious. They don't have a disagreement necessarily, but they don't really come together, which is ironic considering they're at a wedding, because it creates this idea that there's this lovely union going on in the background. But yeah, we hear a lot, don't we, about unreliable narrators, but this isn't the unreliable narrator in the way we might think about it. It's not someone who is intentionally concealing the details, what's happening. It is more about this status, isn't it? Taking up that position. Is it something that you step into? And so, thinking about some of your experiences you just spoke about there, is it something that you step into, step out of when you are writing? Find it easy to assume in the form of writing fiction?
I think it's definitely like it comes very naturally to me. And I think like when I started, because I think pre-pandemic, and this is like, yeah, pre-pandemic, when I was kind of planning to write a collection of short stories, I knew I wanted to write a collection of short stories because I just really love the form. And I think I was interested in apocalypses. I was interested in the idea of the environmental apocalypse. I was interested in dystopias. And I was sort of looking at short fiction and feeling like that wasn't particularly well. I didn't see a lot of that in short fiction. And I know now why. It's because it's very hard to kind of construct an entirely different world in the short form. I mean, there are some writers that do it and do it very well, but I found it challenging. And then I started writing. I wanted to write a book which was a collection kind of based on different geographic locations in the UK, and kind of imagining how they might be with the advancement of global warming. So it's going to be kind of like sci-fi, near future type stuff. And then the pandemic happened, and we were all kind of living in this kind of, imagined horrible future. And also I couldn't go to any of those places. So there was like a practical issue and a kind of artistic issue that then just kind of came together. And so I had to totally kind of obliterate the whole thing. I think everybody, when they start to write something, has an idea of the type of writer that they want to be. Like you look at the writers that you really admire and you think like, yeah, that's that. I love what they do. I wish I could do what they do, or I wish I could, that's that. And I guess status comes into it as well a little bit. Like that's where I want to be. And I think, again, any creative practice, or I mean anything really, which is a passion. And then I think there's like this peeling away of that happens when you start to write and you realize that actually the only writer that you can be is yourself. Sounds really corny, but like I kind of had to go right back to basics and just started writing these kind of like narrative voices and characters that were like feeling kind of unhinged and overwhelmed, or were kind of messy, and writing from that perspective about the world as I saw it. So yeah, so I don't think so. The unreliable thing isn't really a guise particularly. It's just a kind of a state that I definitely got into at that point, and a place from which the writing became like it came easier from that point. It's not to say the book was easy to write, but it came from somewhere which was kind of authentically emotional, I suppose. And I think really like I think most writers I know would probably do that, would kind of it kind of needs to come from your guts really rather than your head at a certain point. They were very specific conditions that created that work, and so now like a different type of pressure needs to come from somewhere else for me to write what I'm writing now. But maybe that's just a kind of second book thing. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess you'll find out, won't you? But
Yes.
yeah, well, I'll tell you what, Claire, we're going to have a quick break. Do come back. Oh, well, obviously, I prefer if you came back. But let's have,
all right then.
yeah, listeners, do come back. We're going to hear more about Claire's short stories, The Unreliable Nature Writer. If you're enjoying today's episode and enjoy listening to writers like Claire, and indeed, if you want to continue promoting the podcast, which inadvertently promotes these fantastic writers that we have on the show, why not leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast provider? Thanks very much, and we'll see you soon for the second half. Welcome back, everybody. I felt like in your stories that there was always, though, a question of who you were trying to address, and the gaze was always sort of moving around in. It makes, and I don't know if you agree, but this is what gives some of these stories the kind of strange and weird, surreal edge to some of them. But you also enjoy writing about animals. I just wondered, what is it about the kind of this idea of the gaze of the animal, looking at the animal, and what it tells us about us. Was this intentional? Was this something that was built throughout the collections?
I think so. I've always been kind of fascinated with the idea of the animal other, and then how that idea is kind of translated into kind of gender dynamics, power dynamics. My dad's a zoologist, so I kind of grew up with this an idea of animals as these kind of multi-dimensional aspects to our lives, as kind of friends and family members and objects of objects to look at, food, a product. And I think that thing, yeah, it's really interesting, the thing you're saying about looking and the gaze, because I think there's this idea of a being, a sentient being that can't communicate with you verbally. And when you're writing about that, and when you're kind of trying to, I suppose, like transmit some perceived communication from them, and what that kind of tells us about humanity and how we communicate and the kind of assumptions that we make, I suppose, about like death and love, and I suppose the way in which we kind of like animals are utilized, not just, I suppose, kind of physically and practically, but also kind of symbolically in culture and in kind of society. So I got quite fixated on dead birds. And I was like dead birds and a few of these things, and I spent like a while going down rabbit holes looking at what dead birds symbolize. And there are some cultures where, like, there are some like indigenous American cultures where dead birds symbolize kind of imminent death. There are some kind of very geographically proximate cultures that will say that dead birds are a sign of new life. So there's this almost like contradictory across the sort of spectrum of human culture as to what these things mean. So you can almost then kind of ascribe whatever meaning you like to anything, and then things become meaningless. And I quite like that. I quite like when you're writing like quite sort of selfish or self-centered or unstable characters, this idea that there's this constantly shifting um, meaning in these things, you know, like the story where the couple wake up and there's a bunch of dead birds everywhere. Like you know, it's a phenomenon that did actually happen in North Wales. Nobody really knows why, but actually the kind of meaning of the situation is that their relationship was falling apart, but even they can't agree on that. So there's this, you know, I suppose that's the kind of unreliability that I'm interested in. You know, you really only have the version that the person's telling you. And I like the idea of just kind of constantly undermining that and calling that into question, because I think that kind of reflected the kind of unsettled sense I had of the world at the time, you know, not really knowing how solid the ground was that I was standing on, and trying to kind of invoke that feeling for the reader, really.
Yeah, it's that way. It is about that, and I should sort of bungled the question, but it's that kind of that gaze, that kind of looking on something
Mm,
that looks back at us, but we can't really. Not that we can do that with humans, but you can't really determine what it is that, how do we interpret then? Does this say something about the world, our relationship to nature, about how we take meaning from it?
mm. Yeah, I think it's about how we utilize nature and how we, you know, even in a kind of, you know, so obviously there's how we use the, you know, the kind of natural world in terms of what we extract from it, and therefore, you know, how it becomes degraded and destroyed. Then there's also a kind of usage of the natural world which is more kind of spiritual, which, you know, you could look at equally cynically, I suppose, like this idea that nature serves to, like, you know, nature is this entity that you go into, you know, and this is something that is talked about a lot in kind of nature writing and critique thereof, is this idea that nature is yeah, is a facility essentially that we can stride out into and feel better or feel at one with something, and then we can come home and we can be okay afterwards. Samantha Walton, who is a kind of ecological scholar and writer and poet, has written a book called The Nature Cure, or In Search of the Nature Cure, sorry, which kind of documents the history of this idea of people going into nature to seek kind of health benefits from it, and what a kind of interrogation of that can, I suppose, teach us about how we can be more kind of environmentally conscious, because actually it's a, you know, if we are just extractive, even kind of psychologically and spiritually um, with the world, with the natural world, it still creates this dichotomy, whereas actually we are part of, you know, everything is part of everything else. You know, there isn't really a divide, there isn't really a kind of binary line between natural and, or, you know, organic and non-organic. And I think I'm really interested in that as a kind of, you know, mind-bending, slightly kind of sublime idea that we're all kind of part of this kind of interconnected thing, that kind of, or this snake eating its own tail. And that the authority that's given to you when you're writing, like this idea that you're supposed to know stuff, and I don't. I'm, you know, and in a way I'm kind of like expressing that I don't really know anything, or I'm not know more than anyone else. I'm just sort of having a human being having an experience that is one of many millions, billions of experiences that other people are having.
Yeah, I mean, you must know. Obviously, you know more than me. I would say, the way that you're talking, you know more than why. Why is it a challenge to sort of to have that have your own? I don't know if it is a question of your own authority, but why do you find it such a challenge?
I think the message, like the idea of a message in a book about the environment, can kind of become problematic over time. So I always use the example of The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which is like, you know, it was like a huge monumental shift in, you know, when it came, I think it came out in 2006. An environmental apocalypse has happened, and it's kind of the wasteland of the remnants of humanity, and it's, you know, bleak and horrifying. um and I suppose the whole thing kind of serves as this warning for what might happen and what we might become if we carry on in the way that we are. It's interesting because that was, you know, getting on for 20 years ago. We are still accelerating, you know. People know, people were warned, we were all warned, um and we're living through like the paralysis of kind of climate dread, and And so I think like sort of warning about a thing that we're all living through feels kind of redundant, I guess. So I'm just kind of swimming around in this place where I'm just like, isn't it weird? But I think maybe in the early 2000s there was, because there was at that time this kind of real, there was this idea that urgent action needed to be taken, but then, for various reasons, mainly political, that wasn't, and actually things kind of got worse. And so I think exacerbate, and there are lots of kind of emerging statistics around particularly within young people, about climate anxiety and the paralysis that climate anxiety induces. So this idea that like, you're absolutely kind of overwhelmed with the horror of what might happen and the kind of how many years are left. And again, I'm not saying that those things are, those statistics and that information shouldn't be in the public, consciousness. It absolutely should. But I suppose what I'm interested in is that condition, the state of anxious paralysis, the state of not knowing what to do, I suppose. Because it's an interest for me. It's an interesting place to write from. It's an interesting condition to write from, and so I kind of like make myself stay static in that.
Yeah, one thing I did think of that, and when I was reading that, so there are these dead animals, and there's this sort of anxiety and uncertainty that we've identified, and we do never feel, as a reader, you don't feel entirely safe or sure of where you are, but that's an enjoyable, well, I found it enjoyable, because obviously you can step out of it, can't you?
Yeah.
And that's a very hard effect to achieve. Just thinking about comments about the world, where it's going, and Cormac McCarthy as well, who wrote this fantastic book about a father and child navigating this incredibly frightening world as a kind of portent. There was, as I read through the collection, it felt like there was a bit of a dynamic going on but I felt like you were saying that part of the problem is the world that the adults have created. And when you write about children, which it's not always frequently, but it felt like there was a different perspective of the world that came from children. I'm thinking in particular of the story of Britannia, Azira, Victoria. And you've got these children looking up into the night sky and they have this wonder. And you write about this child who has this sore neck, which I thought was just a lovely image of someone who's absolutely entranced by the world, what's going on. There's a lot of other stuff going on in this story. There's a kind of a weird cruise with lots of rich people, and again, there's that strange authoritative voice built within it as well. But I just thought this image of a child with a sore neck looking at the world, seeing the stars. There is a sense of wonder out there. There is a sense of a wonder that we can have and perhaps capture.
There is something cathartic in that thing that you describe, the kind of experiencing some kind of horrible bleakness and then being able to shut the book and go back to your normal life. And I think similarly, I think bleakness like intensive bleakness like that has kind of had its time, because, normal life sometimes maybe isn't as unbleak as it once was. And so I think, I wanted to kind of have these moments where it's like, you're not fully alleviating that sense, but you're not kind of just pummeling the reader with this kind of like dread all the time. And I'm really interested in scale. So I'm really interested in the idea of, what happens over an expanse of years and a lifetime, what happens, and like children looking at stars is quite a kind of interesting thing, isn't it? Because you kind of, the scale of that child's life and the scale of the sky are these operating on these two kind of different planes. And again, it's not really about kind of making a point with any of that. I suppose it's just about this image, like these images that feel kind of resonant to the sensation that I'm thinking of. I'm kind of just presenting them and leaving them there for the reader so that the reader can kind of do what they want with them, almost, in a sense.
Yeah, but who knows what the future holds, which is what your story seems to say sometimes.
Yeah.
We don't know what's out there. We don't know what's always coming, but it might not be all that terrible.
No. And I mean, I think that's the thing. I think it's the not knowing. Like, it is, I always just want to emphasize, like, for me, it's the not knowing on on an individual citizen level. It's the not knowing, which is the stressful thing, I suppose.
Yeah, and that can be difficult, can't it? That is, we sort of have to live in it with a sense of certainty, or it makes it very hard to sort of navigate day-to-day life,
Mm,
doesn't it? But
yeah.
got a bit of a book tour, Claire.
I do. So I'm in Toppings in Bath on the 6th, and then the following week I'm at Brick Lane Bookshop in London on the 11th with Ben Pester and Saba Sams, which I'm really excited about. And then the following week I'm going to be in Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester, and then Edinburgh, and then I'm back in Bristol and then Cardiff towards the end of the month. So yeah, and then I'm back in London in July and then in Norwich. So it's just like,
Is
yeah,
it all? Yeah.
it
Wow.
really is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Roadies
fantastic.
and stuff. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, great to hear you coming up north,
Yes.
which is where I'm based. So maybe, yeah, maybe we'll see one of them. And if you are out and
Yeah.
about, then make sure you go to one of these events too. Claire, it has been a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much for sharing so much about your craft and the kind of feelings about being a writer, because writers have feelings too, don't they? But yeah, thank you for being really candid and just letting us in
Thank
on
you.
what it was like to write these stories. The Unreliable Nature Writer, published by Scratch Books, is out next month in June. But for now, Claire, thank you very much for being on the Rippling Pages.
Thank you.